Good morning, everybody. This lesson is about the relationship between the state and the party in the Third Reich, Nazi Germany, 1933. We only go as far as 1935. Obviously, the Third Reich lasted until 1945, but for this specification, the depth study requires us to focus, to borehole and drill into the early years, the first 3 years of the Third Reich. The picture that we've got there, well, it's a collection of photographs, is just sort of individuals, and I've divided them for you. On the left there, we've got the sort of leading state personnel, and then on the right, we've got leading party members from the Nazi Party. Have a look, see how many of those you recognise. Hopefully, I'm sure you will recognise at least a few. Anyway, we'll push on. That's just a reminder that 2 days' time, there is a essay due. It's your essay number 5. To what extent was the Nazi takeover of power 1933 to 34 a legal revolution? Full details are in an assignment in Teams, and there's a YouTube video which I'll walk and talk you through, giving guidance about how to analyse that question and use that to structure a plan. And remember, you must write that as a timed examination, so you need to sort of like obviously memorise the content that will go into your answer. So that's due in this Friday. And thinking ahead, you know what I'm going to say next? There is your next question. Now that's exactly a calendar month later, actually, the 22nd of June. It's a Monday, so that will be essay number 6. And this one is directly related to what we are working on at the moment and what we have been doing for the last 3 or 4 lessons, the political structure of the Third Reich and how lawmaking or how power existed inside Nazi Germany. So it's a quote: "The consequence of Hitler's leadership style was that he was a dictator who did not dictate." How far do you agree with the statement about Germany 1933 to 35? And that's actually from the second specimen paper. The next, let's give a little bit of guidance about that. I'm not going to talk through those here. What I will do is I will record for you sometime within the next week a separate YouTube video in which I walk and talk you through an approach to tackling that particular question. Just to make sure that you don't sort of like fall foul at the beginning and misinterpret the question and go off on the wrong tangent, just to give you the broad brushstrokes. So I'll do that as a separate YouTube video. So I'll just skip through that. And there's a reminder of where we are. As you can see, we are at the, we've now reached the end with today's lesson of Depth Study 3. So, well, I say that it's pretty much at the end. There is, remember, here 2 more lessons in which we look at racial policy 1933 to 35. Okay, that's part of the depth study. That is sort of wrapped around that 3 lessons before it. We look at society, and then we look at Nazi economic policies. And that's the breadth study part of the examination. But we put the racial policy into the middle of those 6 lessons, simply because it makes more sense to sort of like look at that particular point. Okay, but that racial policy is, strictly speaking, part of section B in the examination. Okay, and again, a reminder of the stretch reading for this topic. And I've already talked you through that chapter by Stephen J. Lee. 2 excellent essays. Make sure you read those essays. I've also uploaded my own notes to those essays to the Padlet area. In addition, remember, for each of those 2 essays, there's a Quizlet And I've also recorded for each of those essays a podcast in which I walk and talk you through my notes to those essays. Really adds depth and understanding to what we have been working on for these last 3 or 4 lessons, but in particular today's lesson, because it is about the nature of government and how the political structures worked. Okay, so that's essential really for you to be working your way through those over the next couple of weeks or so, so that will help you prepare for that essay that's due on the 22nd of June. Okay, and likewise, Noakes and Pridham chapter 6 I've referred to in previous lessons, really excellent on the political system. Okay, so let's start looking at the history of this, the relationship between the state and the party. This is just really to sort of like get you thinking about it. The state on the left here, this shows before the 30th of January, in other words, in the Weimar Republic. Okay, so you've got the state, which is the sort of pyramid structure. I mean, another word for the state in a sense is the civil service. We'll come on to that in a second, exactly what the state is, and the Nazi Party. And they're both separate entities, okay? And the Nazi Party is, what they've got in common is they're both a pyramid structure. So there's a sort of headquarters. For the state, it would be in Berlin. The civil service, the main ministries are the headquarters of the civil service, and of course there are regional and local branches of the civil service that stretch down to all the cities and towns, the small towns of Germany. So the state is an extensive pyramid structure. Okay, in any country, it's not just Weimar Germany. Britain today, we have a civil service. Okay, the state is responsible basically for implementing the law. Okay, paid civil servants, professionals working for different government departments. Then, of course, you've got the Nazi Party, and the point is it's completely separate from the state. Okay, the Nazi Party was an organisation that was formed in the 1920s in the Weimar Republic. Likewise, it was a pyramid structure, and at the top of it was the party leadership, and at the very top was Adolf Hitler. And a bit like the state, it had a headquarters. Actually, the headquarters was in Munich, not in Berlin. But it had regions of provincial officers and regional officers, and went down to local levels, etc. I mean, there were different titles of the people who worked in the party. We don't really need to get into that, sort of like Ortsgruppenleiters and things like that. But it was a pyramid structure. But it was a completely different entity from the state. Okay, the state is a civil service that is responsible for implementing the law of the land, whereas a political party is an entity that exists to serve a party leader, and the purpose of a party is to project their message to the people, to win votes, to capture votes in general elections. Okay, so that's basically two separate entities, and they did exist separately in Germany in the Weimar era. Then, of course, Hitler took power. The leader of the Nazi Party took power in 1933, and here, notice it's the summer of 1933, not January 1933, but 6 months into Hitler's power. Notice what's happened. The party leadership has taken over the top level of the state. And remember, the top level of the state are the ministries, the government departments in Berlin. Okay. Now, it's more complicated than that, and this is what we need to look at this lesson, because they didn't take over every single ministry, but they took over some of the key ministries. Okay, it was a partial takeover at the top level of the state, and that's basically what that diagram is telling you. about what changed after Hitler took power on a simplistic level. But we're going to look at the nuances of this as we go through this particular video. That diagram, in a sense, tells you the same thing. Okay, so you've got that. There's the Nazi Party. In fact, everything in brown represents something to do with the party. Okay, so you've got the Nazi Party. You've got at the top of the party, you've got Hitler, and Hitler at the very apex of the top of the party itself was an office called the Party Chancellery. That's like the sort of like the headquarters of the party. Remember, the party is an extensive apparatus. It's stretched down to every town and every region of Germany. There were local party officials that worked for Hitler in the different regions of Germany. But at the very top, in the party headquarters, which, as I say, was actually in Munich, and I think it always continued to be in Munich, even though the capital city was in Berlin, was the Party Chancellery, which had a team of party members who manned that. And of course, Hitler, as the Führer of the party at the top, communicated to the party through the Party Chancellery. Okay, and there were other party organisations. So of course, you've got the paramilitary group, the SA. But remember, of course, in 1934, the SS split away, and as a reward for what it did on the Night of the Long Knives, it became a fully independent entity in its own right, separate from the SA. So straight away, therefore, you've actually got a multiple different party organisations just on that simple diagram there. And as I say, all party organisations represented in brown. Then, represented in blue, are the instruments of the state. Now, the state is separate from the party. The state was there before Hitler took power. The state is always there. Okay, the state is simply the team of professional civil servants. They're not politicians. They are simply there to implement the law. Okay, to ensure that whatever laws are passed by the politicians, that they are implemented. So you've got lots of state departments. You've got the Ministry of Agriculture, the Ministry of Economics, the Ministry of Education, etc., etc. Okay, and that's broadly what we could talk about as the civil service. Okay, and at the top level of the civil service, you've got the Reich Chancellery. Okay, which is the sort of like headquarters of the civil services, and of course, Hitler, once he had taken power in 1934, of course, he took over the cabinet following the Enabling Act. Basically, the cabinet became his key instrument. Laws could now be passed without the Reichstag, so notice how the Reichstag is no longer relevant. And so Hitler would communicate to the cabinet, that would then communicate to the Reich Chancellery, and that would then communicate down through the civil service to make sure that whatever laws Hitler issued were implemented. But of course, again, it's more complicated than that because, as we said, Hitler increasingly didn't use the cabinet, and Hitler would distance himself 400 miles away from the capital city. So even the Reich Chancellery in Berlin often would go months without seeing Hitler. Okay, but remember, at the Reich Chancellery level, you've got this man Hans Lammers, who was very efficient and did a good job in sort of like implementing what he understood Hitler's will to be, and managing that side of things. We talked about that before. So all of this is explained in a little bit of commentary there, and obviously there. So read through that diagram, and also notice that sort of idea of overlap here between the party and the state. Okay, this part here, I've deliberately shown here an overlap. It's a little bit not as clear as perhaps it could be, because the overlap tended to be more at the upper levels, as I showed on the previous diagram. At the top levels, you tended to get Nazi party members who became the ministers, okay, at the top, at the upper levels of the party, taking of the state, taking over the upper levels of the state. Let's move on to what we're going to work through today. So there's our mind map. Have it out in front of you. We've got 5 strands to go through, and you can pause the video as we work our way through this. And that's the sort of big picture that we'll reach at the end of this video. We'll start off with the Weimar era, okay? So in that sort of introduction, in a sense, I think I've covered most of what's on the page here. So let's just read it and make sure you're happy with it. In a nutshell, it's important to understand the difference between state and party and how these two features interrelate. The state is the fixed, established machinery which a government uses to run the country. Okay. In fact, we often therefore talk about the establishment. Okay, and if you come across that in your reading, that term, the establishment, is a loose term, but we often use that to refer to the civil service. Okay, it's there, it's fixed, it doesn't come and go with elections. Okay, so civil servants, but included in the state would be the policemen, our policing, teachers, part of the civil service, the judiciary, and in a sense the army, the Reichswehr that we've already looked at, is part of the state system. It's fixed. What we're saying here is governments come and go with elections, don't they? Politicians, okay, they're elected into power with a general election, and then 4 years later they're elected out of power, and other group of politicians step in. And a useful distinction there is the state is like the motor car, it's the machinery. Okay, the people who staff the state apparatus, they're not politicians. They serve the law, they don't serve a political party. Okay, so I'm a teacher, my job is to teach. I don't lose my job when the government is voted out of office and a new government is voted in. Okay, I'm not a servant of a political party. I'm a servant of the state apparatus. Is a way to look at it, and that's what we talk about when we mean the state. I always have that image of a motor car, whereas the party is like the driver of the motor car. Okay, it's not fixed. It's transitory. It comes and goes. Okay, different parties take power each time there is an election, and they have power for a defined period. They drive the car. They pass the laws. They don't implement them. The state implements the laws. The party passes them. So they're the politicians that drive the machine, and the party that's in power, the upper level, the drivers, are called ministers. Okay, so there's a minister of education, a minister of foreign affairs, a minister of agriculture, minister of economics, etc. And that group of ministers sit in a room, and it happens in Downing Street today. Boris Johnson is the Prime Minister, and a collection of ministers sit around in one room, and they're called a cabinet. And it's the cabinet which decides policy. The cabinet is, another word, is the executive. Okay, when we talk about the government, really what we're talking about there is the cabinet, a group of men and women who decide what they want the laws to be, and then they go and present the proposed law, known as a bill, to Parliament. And Parliament is a larger collection of party members. Okay, again, Parliament is not civil servants. Parliament is elected members of political parties who sit together in a much larger group, and of course a proposed law called a bill does not become a law until it has been voted on and passed by a majority, 50% or more. So the elected members of Parliament, all of whom belong to different parties. The Parliament in Germany was called the Reichstag, although in the local states, the state parliaments were called Landtags. and the Parliament is the legislature. Okay, the legislature. It is the law-making body, whereas the cabinet is the executive. So again, that's an important distinction just to understand. So that's the party. Okay, and as a general rule, state and party are separate. Okay, the state is the machine, it's the motor car. The party is the driver of the machine. So in other words, people employed in the state continue in their jobs after a general election, whereas after a general election, the ruling party changes, and so the members of the cabinet and the Reichstag change. Okay. Only at the very, very top level of the state is there a takeover. So whatever party is in power, a member of that party will become the Minister of Education. Okay? And that person will hold that position while his party is in power. But beneath the Minister of Education is the Ministry of Education, which is a big department, government department with headquarters used in Britain today in central London, but with a network of universities and schools, etc., that stretches down to every region of the land. Those people are civil servants who work for the state. That they will at the top will be the Minister of Education, who is a politician who belong to the party that's in power, but the machinery is separate from the actual party. Okay, so there's a bit more detail there about the party and state in the Weimar era. That's where I use the analogy of a motor car and the drivers. Okay, so just pause this video and have a quick read through that and add anything more that you want to add to your mind map. The point at the bottom is an interesting one. Okay. Other countries that have had revolutions, very different from Germany, such as the Communist Revolution in Russia in 1917 and the Communist Revolution in China in 1949, was different. Effectively, the state became the party. Okay, they completely merged. So when the Russian Revolution happened in 1917, in effect, the Bolshevik Party completely took over the state. And so that's why we in those places, we talk about one-party states. It's clear that party organisations play the primary role in governing the country. Emphasise this did not happen in Nazi Germany. This is what we're going to be looking at. The party was not allowed to take over the running of the state. To a large extent, the state in Nazi Germany continued to function separately from the party. Okay, so there's our first strand. Okay, so state independence from the NSDAP. That pretty much links into what I just said. Unlike Russia or China, the German state apparatus was never fully taken over by the party. That was uniquely something to do with Nazi Germany. Okay, so when Hitler talked about having a one-party state and the party was now running the country, it simply was not true. Hitler did not allow the party to take over the state. The state, throughout the 12 years that Hitler ruled Germany, continued to be largely separate from the Nazi Party. Okay, and this is what we're talking about here. So let's just go through the points. So as historians, we need to distinguish between what Hitler claimed to be fact and the actual truth. Hitler often said things for propaganda purposes, okay, and not least, he often claimed the Nazi Party was running the country. Actually, they weren't. Okay, so let's think about this. And you know a lot about it already. In the summer of 1933, following the months of Gleichschaltung, which we've already covered, Hitler made that claim that the Nazi Party had fully taken over the running of the state, as had happened in Russia after the revolution of 1917. In 1918, the Communist Party took over the running of the state. So Hitler claimed that state and party had become one. Think of those two pyramids that we looked at earlier. In effect, the party pyramid moved and suddenly sat on top of the state pyramid, and all the people in the party took over the key jobs in the state at every level, not just in the capital city, but going all the way down to the local towns and villages. Okay, that all the state functionaries, the people who worked in the state, lost their jobs, and the party took over everything. That's what Hitler, in a sense, liked to maintain, that illusion, but it simply was not true. The party was not allowed to take over the state. So what Hitler claimed was a long, long way from the truth. In reality, Hitler did allow the Nazi Party to take over the running of the state at the higher levels. So I've already given examples of that. Some of the ministries at the very top level, the minister himself would become a Nazi. Okay, and we'll look in more detail at that. Not every single ministry, but the important ones. Nazis took over top jobs at headquarters. Okay, but at the middle and lower sections of the state, and we're talking about hundreds of thousands of jobs here, paid civil servants, they didn't really notice any change. The Hitler took power, but the same paid civil servants kept on doing their jobs, working at their jobs for the next 12 years without necessarily noticing any real significant change. Okay, because Hitler did not allow the Nazi Party to take over everything. Okay, so at the higher levels, yes, in the sections of the state where Nazi control was seen to be necessary, for example, the police force, there was a takeover. So the old police chiefs lost their jobs and party members took over their jobs. Yeah, but Hitler prevented the Nazi Party fully taking over many state departments. Okay, now an example of that would be, for example, the Ministry of Economics. Okay, the top level, the Minister of Economics, until 1938, was not a Nazi. Okay, and in fact, at most levels in the Ministry of Economics, which employed hundreds and thousands of people, this is civil servants, okay, whose job was to manage the economy. The same people who had their jobs before Hitler took power continued to keep their jobs whilst Hitler was in power, and they were not members of the Nazi Party. Okay, and that went right to the very top. Even the Minister of Economics himself, Hjalmar Schacht, was not a Nazi, was not a member of the Nazi Party. Okay, so that's really important to understand. Why was that? Because Hitler knew the Nazi Party members, yeah, they may have been committed Nazis, but they lacked the experience to run state affairs efficiently. So the Foreign Office was the same. Until 1938, Hitler's foreign minister, a man called Konstantin von Neurath, was not a Nazi. He was right-wing, he was a conservative, yes. He had been in office before 1933, before Hitler took power. Hitler kept him in office. Okay, there were other Nazis who desperately wanted to become Minister of Foreign Affairs, but Hitler didn't allow that to happen. And likewise, the whole apparatus of the Foreign Office, the diplomats, the ambassadors in different countries, to a large extent, Hitler kept the same people in the same jobs. Why? Because they were experienced at doing their jobs, and the Nazis didn't have that experience. Hitler was very clear that he would rather have a professional, efficient non-Nazi doing a state job than an inexperienced Nazi who would do a bad job. Okay, we've done this. Think about when we did about the Night of the Long Knives. What did Hitler do in 1933? He called a halt to a second revolution because men like Ernst Röhm wanted all the key jobs in the state apparatus to be taken over by party members, which included the stormtroopers themselves, the SA. And in particular, what Rome wanted was the stormtroopers to take over that part of the state which is responsible for defending the nation's frontiers, the army. Okay, so that whole story about the origins of the knife of the long knives is part of this picture about Hitler wanting to halt the second revolution. Okay, so the second revolution did not happen. It happened in Russia in 1918 because Lenin allowed the party to take over the state. It happened in China in 1949 because Mao allowed the party to take over the state. In Nazi Germany, that second revolution, which is the party taking over the state, was halted. Okay, and the party was kept separate from the state. That's what we're talking about there. Okay, and of course Hitler very famously insisted that revolution turn into evolution. So it meant that in certain key areas of policy, and I've given the examples, in which stability was needed, evolution, gradual change was needed in order to achieve medium-term objectives. Nazi party members were told to shadow the state, but not take it over. Okay, keep an eye on it. Okay, so the party, within the Nazi party, there would be an office that would be the ideological department about what they believed, how they believed the economy should be run, and they'd write pamphlets about how they believed the economy should be run. Now, those people desperately wanted to take over the jobs in the Ministry of Economics, but Hitler wouldn't allow them to. He would say, you can shadow them, you can keep an eye on them, okay? And if members of the Ministry of Economics don't behave themselves, then maybe we'll let one or two of you take over some of the jobs in the Ministry of Economics just to keep the Ministry of Economics in line, to keep it obedient. But on the whole, we don't want you guys because you're not efficient. You don't have experience at running the economy. We want the old professional civil servants to run the economy. Okay, so what were those areas? Well, we covered that in the last couple of lessons, didn't we? Hitler's medium-term objectives were creating jobs, solving unemployment. That's why the Ministry of Economics is a great example. He doesn't want to rock the boat by putting in inefficient Nazis running the economy because he's got to create jobs for the people. Revision of the Treaty of Versailles. He wants to get the Treaty of Versailles revised, but he wants to do it. He wants to persuade the British and the French to give him what he wants without going to war. Now, if he puts a bunch of radical Nazis into the Foreign Office, they're not going to be very good at having diplomatic language and negotiating and showing willingness to compromise, which is what you need to be able to do if you're going to achieve your objectives in foreign affairs without going to war. So let's keep the experts, the experienced people in there. Konstantin von Neurath, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, may not be a Nazi, but he was a respectable conservative and he would be very good at negotiating with the British and the French to get the terms of the Treaty of Versailles revised. Okay, so all of this basically meant, again, go back to it, you've got your state structure, the state, and you've got the party structure. Okay, I'll do a little swastika there, the party structure. And although there was a hunger for the party to take over the state, in effect, Hitler said, yeah, maybe at the top levels here and there, we'll the policing and we'll come on to that in a minute, which parts of the state they did take over. But on the whole, at the lower levels of the state, most of the key jobs were kept by the same old people, and in particular in those parts of the state apparatus that were responsible for creating jobs and foreign affairs issues. Okay, so that created a bit of confusion. Okay, because it wasn't always clear who's actually running things, who's in charge. The party wanted to take over, but Hitler wouldn't allow them. The state were not fully taken over. They were, in theory, in charge, but at the same time there was an overlap. So we'll move on to that and explore. Okay. So there's a bit more detail there. Again, you can pause it. Let's have look at the words in bold. There's the overlap. to some extent, state institutions were controlled by the Nazi Party. So, for example, here's an example there. Very quickly, all Jews were any Jews inside the civil servant lost their jobs. Okay, in 1933, if you were a member of a communist party and you couldn't, you lost your job, you were kicked out. But on the whole, most civil servants kept their jobs. Okay. Hitler never allowed the Nazi Party to take full control, and the best example is the German military and, of course, the Night of the Long Knives we've already talked about, the halting of the Second Revolution there. There's another example. Robert Lai attempted to use the Nazi Party organisation, the DAF, the German Workers' Front, to influence economic affairs, but was mostly unsuccessful. Okay, the Ministry of Economics, which is part of the state, it's a civil service department, was staffed by Hjalmar Schacht. He was the Minister of Economics. He wasn't even a Nazi, but he had Hitler's full support. And so the Economics Ministry that controlled the German economy as an important state institution escaped coordination. It was not gleichschaltend, certainly not until the late 1930s. And there's the point that another example of confusion is that Hitler claimed to have created a one-party state. He made that claim. He actually passed a law, the Law for the Unity of Party and State, in the summer of 1933. It was true to an extent. There was only one legal political party in Germany. Okay, Germany was a one party. It was no longer a pluralist society, but it kind of implied that the state had been taken over by the party, and it simply hadn't, because Hitler never allowed the Nazi Party to fully take over the institutions of the state. Okay, so this political system is sometimes called dualism because clearly there's two power structures. There's the civil service and there's the party. And the party was like a shadow state, but it was not the formal state. Okay, that they existed side by side, and they often had to compete with each other, and it did lead to an overlapping at different levels, and there was constant tension between the two because people in the state were constantly looking over their shoulders and knowing they had to behave because the party were hungry to take their jobs. And sometimes there was confusion at a local level with the party muscling in and telling the state what to do, and it was never really clear as who was in charge. And that's all part of the sort of chaos that tended to result. But again, remember, perhaps Hitler wanted that. Keep the state on its toes. The party is wanting to take their jobs. Isn't this the survival of the fittest and social Darwinism in action that we're talking about here? Okay. Right, there we are. So we've done that one. 2 down, 3 to go. Let's move into then the next strand about the overlap. Okay, develop a little bit more knowledge about the overlap. So as I said, as a general rule, the party was not allowed to take over the state as a general rule, but there were notable exceptions, and this is what you need to understand what the notable exceptions were. Okay, so what were the exceptions? 3 of them. Okay, with the notable exceptions. First, so these are the notable exceptions in which Hitler did allow the party to largely take over a section of the state. Firstly, law and order. In effect, the police force. Okay. In Britain today, the government department that's responsible for law and order is the Home Office, okay, and the minister is the Home Secretary, okay. In Germany, the minister was the Minister of the Interior. Remember his name? Wilhelm Frick. Okay, so in January 1933. Wilhelm Frick was the man who sat on the cabinet. He was a Nazi. He was only one of the only 3 Nazis on the cabinet in January 1933, but that was an important one. Hitler wanted a Nazi for the Ministry of the Interior, because the Ministry of the Interior, in theory, controlled the police, although in reality it was not that easy, because in Germany the police was, of course, was controlled by the separate federal states. And so Hitler had to work hard in 1933 to 34 to take power of policing away from the federal states and to transfer it to the Minister of the Interior in Berlin, Wilhelm Frick. And then, of course, there was a struggle because Wilhelm Frick suddenly was fighting against other Nazis who wanted to take over the police, initially Goering, and ultimately Heinrich Himmler won that battle. And by 1936, policing had been brought into the hands of Heinrich Himmler. Okay, so firstly, and we'll come more into that in a minute, okay, but firstly, the instruments of law and order were swiftly coordinated by the Nazi Party in the months of Gleichschaltung 1933. Because clearly Hitler wanted to take, he needed, if he's going to retain power, he's got to have control over the streets. He's got to be able to police Germany. So that was initially, Hitler wasn't at all interested in coordinating the Ministry of Agriculture, for example. Yeah, that was way down his list. At the beginning in 1933, it was the Ministry of the Interior and the control of the policing that was important. And there was a power struggle between leading Nazis, as I say, Frick versus Goering versus Himmler, okay, to control the police. But by 1936, Himmler won that battle. Secondly, the federal states, okay, those separate German states, remember, each of which had its own government and its own parliament, a Landtag. So although Hitler had taken power in Berlin of the Reich government, the national government, at the local level, of course, they were controlled by other parties. So that needed to be sorted out. And we've done a whole lesson on that, okay? That was coordinated. So remember, that happened because Hitler used the Gauleiters, the regional propaganda chiefs of the Nazi Party, and they were made Reich governors, and the Reich governors were centrally controlled by Hitler, accountable to Hitler. And we did last lesson about how the Gauleiters were very independent in their attitudes and style. And they often ran their territories as mini Hitlers, refused to follow the direction of either state or party, just Hitler. Okay, so that's another slight confusion to the issue, okay, that made it sort of like even more confusing. But nevertheless, the state lost control, okay, over the different regions because the separate regional state governments were coordinated by the Nazi Party. And thirdly, the German media, newspapers, cinema, literature, theatre, music, anything that kind of like controls the way people think. There was no State Department that really coordinated this in Weimar Germany. Media was very much sort of like privately owned and operated, but Hitler knew that he needed to be able to take control over what messages were printed and read about and watched in the theatre and the films, etc. So Hitler created a whole new State Department, the Ministry of Popular Enlightenment and Propaganda, led by Joseph Goebbels, his propaganda chief, who became the Minister of Propaganda. And that was actually a State Department. It was within the civil service apparatus, but of course, as a brand new State Department, Hitler ensured that it was fully staffed by party members. So that's, again, an exception, isn't it? Okay. Now, finally, it's important to note that in the first two of these three areas, okay, so law and order there and the federal states, there was an internal power struggle within the party as to who would control this. And that resulted in some inefficiency. So I mentioned with the policing, there was a power struggle between three leading Nazis, Frick against Goering against Himmler, competing against each other to take over the police. Likewise with the federal states. Ultimately, they were brought under the control of the Gauleiters. The Gauleiters should have been taking their orders from the Minister of the Interior in Berlin, but in fact they operated independently. They just did what they wanted in their separate regions, and they worked very, very independently, and that frustrated the party, the Nazi Party, in particular the Ministry of the Interior, who had no control over the Gauleiters. The Gauleiters were responsible only to Hitler himself. Okay, so a bit more detail then. To pick that one up, I mean, just spend time looking at the bits in bold. So there's the bit, the party police force, a notable exception. Himmler and the SS ultimately took control of it. There's the internal party struggle between Goering, Frick and Himmler for the police. The Gauleiters, largely independent of state control, they ran their territories as mini Hitlers. So there's that word struggle, remember. Okay, frequent clashes between the Ministry of the Interior, Frick, and the separate Gauleiters. They're all Nazis, but they were ruthlessly ambitious and they spent a lot of time fighting against each other. But Hitler just allowed that to happen. It caused chaos, but arguably Hitler intended that to happen because it was part of his social Darwinist view about promoting the strong. Okay, so there's that third strand. Two more to go. Plenipotentiaries. What were these? Okay. So you've got the state, which was there before 1933, civil service, in other words, okay, non-Nazi. You've got the party, there before 1933, and to some extent it was allowed to take over sections of the state, but not much of it. It kind of depends about which State Department you've got. Okay, that's dualism, and you've got Hitler at the top. Okay, who is head of state but head of party. Occasionally, quite often actually, as leader of Germany, Hitler would suddenly create another organisation, or he would create another organisation. And that was directly created by him. And this organisation is what you call a plenipotentiary. So it was separate from the party and separate from the state. And this is what we mean when we talk about polycracy. Because Hitler would suddenly create a brand new organisation and say, you're in charge of that area of policy. And that area of policy, there was already a struggle to control that area of policy between party and state. And then Hitler would suddenly create another organisation and say, I want you to take control of that policy. So that would add further to the confusion in this sort of like jungle world of Nazi politics that Hitler seemed to be promoting. So let's read about this. Further inefficiency and confusion resulted from Hitler's tendency to create special Nazi organisations called plenipotentiaries. Big word, make sure you learn to spell that one. A Nazi organisation led by a leading Nazi, which was formally separate from both the state and the party, whose authority came directly from Hitler and which was commissioned by Hitler with a special task. And that special task was usually central to Hitler's worldview, his vision. It was something very close to his heart that he wanted to achieve. Try to use that word Weltanschauung. It means worldview. Okay, notice there's two U's there in Weltanschauung. You come across that a lot in your reading. Hitler's Weltanschauung. It just simply means his vision, his worldview, the way he saw the world. In other words, plenipotentiaries were usually tasked to take control of areas of policy that Hitler was especially interested in. Okay, so for example, plenipotentiaries was created to coordinate the police. The SS was a plenipotentiary. Okay, it was separate from the party. Now the SS is unusual in the sense that the SS existed before 1933. Most plenipotentiaries were created after Hitler took power. Okay, but the SS was created before. Plenipotentiaries were created to take over in the long term the military, hence the Waffen-SS. Okay, the transport system. That was an unusual one, the transport system. It was called the TOT organisation, TODT. You get it on the notes on the next page. And the Hitler Youth by Baldur von Schirach as an example of a plenipotentiary. So Baldur von Schirach was the Hitler's plenipotentiary for educating the German youth. So in many ways, Hitler's inclination to create plenipotentiaries often added further to confusion and inefficiency that already existed because there was a power struggle between party and state. So it kind of like led to a three-way confusion about who's in charge of this area of German life, whatever it may be. So let's say education of young people. Is it the state? Is it the party? Or is it a plenipotentiary, the Hitler Youth? Okay, so you get those sorts of power struggles taking place in Nazi Germany. Okay, so the SS are a classic example of a plenipotentiary. Neither party nor state, they clashed with both. And there's a little diagram from the Night of the Long Knives that represented that. And the SS, as a result of the Night of the Long Knives, became effectively a plenipotentiary. They were rewarded with full independence from the SA, but Hitler didn't choose to put them within part of the party. He said, you are now an instrument of my will. You obey nobody but me personally. Nobody, a member of the Nazi party can't tell the SS what to do. Okay, so the SS were independent of the party. And there are the examples. So again, I think read through them, okay, and pick out the words in bold and make sure they go into your notes. So there's the organisation TOT, led by Fritz Todt. He was General Inspector for German roads, and he completely bypassed the Ministry of Transport. Okay, so the building of the autobahns had nothing to do with the Ministry of Transport, bizarre as that is. The Ministry of Transport is a state office, but the autobahn building programme, it was so important to Hitler, the building of these motorways, was managed by a plenipotentiary organisation. Okay, the military, we've already done a whole lesson about the military, but the Waffen-SS, ultimately the SS increasingly challenged the dominance of the army. Okay, Hitler also created a new branch of the armed forces, the Air Force. Okay, Treaty of Versailles had forbidden Germany from having an air force. Hitler took power, he created the Luftwaffe, and the Luftwaffe was placed under a newly created Reich Aviation Ministry controlled by a Nazi called Hermann Göring. And that ministry was a plenipotentiary because although it was called a ministry, it had nothing to do with the Ministry of Defence. The Ministry of Defence was the traditional branch of the civil service that managed which managed the armed forces. The army basically sat under the Ministry of Defence, which was the state department for managing the military. But Hitler created this Reich Aviation Ministry, and it had nothing to do with the state. It was a plenipotentiary led by Hermann Göring. Okay, the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe. And then, of course, the police. Okay, so as I said, there was a three-way struggle. Policing was originally controlled, remember, by the separate German states. There's a Prussian police, a Bavarian police, etc. Very quickly, the powers were taken away. Remember the Reichstag fire decree of 28th of February 1933 gave Hitler the power to take policing away from the states and transfer them to the Reich Ministry of the Interior in Berlin. Well, the Ministry of the Interior was Frick, But he didn't keep control of policing very long, because ultimately Goering wanted to take control of it. Goering was the Minister of the Interior in Prussia, and Prussia was 60% of Germany. But behind the scenes, the SS ultimately emerged, and Hitler allowed the SS as the plenipotentiary there to take full control over Germany's police forces. And by 1936, all of those separate German police forces were centralised into one instrument led by Heinrich Himmler. Okay, so that's the point that is talked about there. And then the other one is the Ministry of Education. Within the state, there was a state department, the Ministry of Education, largely staffed by non-Nazis. At the top level, Hitler put a Nazi in charge as the Minister of Education, Bernhard Rust, but Hitler created a plenipotentiary called the Hitler Youth, led by Baldur von Schirach. And of course, there was a constant struggle for power between these two men over who would control the minds of the Hitler Youth. Would it be the Ministry of Education, which was a state department led by a Nazi, or would it be the plenipotentiary of the Hitler Youth, led by Baldur von Schirach, which was accountable directly to Hitler and not to the party? Okay, so that's plenipotentiaries. So I think we're probably getting a sense now of what, hopefully you're developing a picture of understanding why there was confusion in Germany with so many competing power structures. So we'll just conclude by sort of pulling this together, the reasons for the confusion. So much of this is recapping, really, what we've already covered in a previous lesson. So to conclude, Nazi Germany then was a polycratic system, many different organisations, all to varying degrees controlled by Nazis, but not really working together in an efficient way. Okay, so polycratic, multiple organisations. So you've got the state, which is divided into different ministries. You've got the Nazi party, and you've got the plenipotentiaries. And each, to different degrees, was controlled by ambitious Nazis competing against each other. And the state largely only at the top level taken over by the Nazi party, apart from certain state departments like the Ministry of the Interior and ministries that were like the propaganda ministry. But most state departments were not really fully taken over by Nazis. But then you've got the party and you've got the plenipotentiaries competing to take control, shadowing them. And historians are divided about whether this confusion was deliberate or accidental. Some historians argue that the chaos was not intended by Hitler. Okay. And that it happened accidentally as a result of Hitler's unusual and disorganised approach to government. In other words, these historians argue that the inefficiency was an accidental outcome of Hitler's leadership style. See previous notes and my separate YouTube video about Hitler's leadership style, where we go into all of that. Other historians argue that Hitler intended this chaos and confusion to happen, and these historians tend to build their arguments around two reasons. Firstly, that Hitler used a strategy of what we call divide and rule, which strengthened his power. Okay, and that's the sort of argument that Hitler would deliberately allow leading Nazis to compete against each other for it to control an area of policy. So Frick competed against Goering, Goering beat Frick to take control over the policing. Then Himmler came in and Himmler competed against Goering, and Himmler won that battle, and by 1936 policing was under the control of Himmler. And in the meantime, these three Nazis are busy fighting against each other, and that in a sense strengthened Hitler, because each of those three Nazis would look up the pyramid towards Hitler for his support as they fought their separate turf wars. And Hitler would have to do nothing. It simply strengthened his power. He would watch the game play out, and then ultimately he would step in and side with who was winning the war. Okay, and and that person would then be grateful to Hitler for Hitler's support. And throughout the whole of the 12-year history of the Third Reich, no senior Nazi used their massive power base, and they were massively powerful. People like Himmler in charge of the police and Robert Lai in charge of the workers. They had enormous power bases. In other countries, like Russia and China, these type of people often would use their power base to turn against the guy at the top. But in Germany, they were all very loyal to him. Okay, so that's the point that's made there. Secondly, remember, this approach of struggle fits in with Hitler's worldview. He's a social Darwinist. He believes in the law of the nature, the law of the jungle, okay, because it weeds out the weak and promotes the strong. And again, a strong argument that Hitler allowed that confusion to exist because that was part of his worldview, his Weltanschauung. And you can very much see that in the three case studies of economic policy, foreign policy, and military policy. Okay, so why did this confusion exist? The details that sits beneath it. Okay, why did he not simply implement total party control as happened in the Soviet Union or China? It's again worthwhile making that point in the exam. It shows synoptic knowledge and awareness of what was happening in other countries. Why did he not simply sack the Minister of Transport and appoint Todt? Why did he not sack the Minister of Education and appoint Chirac? And one reason is that the relationship enhanced Hitler's power, and that's divide and rule. Let them fight against each other. Another reason is part of Hitler's worldview, social Darwinism, the law of the jungle. And then you've got these three case studies. Okay, for example, the economy. In the early years of his dictatorship, Hitler needed to assure influential industrialists that the Nazis would not make any radical changes because he needed to create jobs. Okay, he needed ultimately to make weapons, and it was to Hitler's advantage to put a man, Schacht, who was not a Nazi, in charge of the economics ministry. Later on in 1936, Hitler needed to radicalise the German economy, prepare it more for war, and at that point it made sense to remove Schacht, and Hitler created a plenipotentiary for preparation for war called the 4-year plan, led by a man called Hermann Göring, which led to the fall of Schacht. And when Schacht fell, this man, Walter Funk, replaced him as Minister of Economics, but Funk was subordinate to the plenipotentiary, Hermann Göring. He became the sort of top dog, really, in terms of war preparation. So things changed in the late 1930s. But again, you can see that interplay of a struggle within the story of the... Likewise, with foreign policy. In the early years, it was very important to Hitler. He needed to reassure Britain, America, and France that his demands to revise the Treaty of Versailles were fair and his intentions were peaceful. He did not want war, was the message he wanted to put across. Now, if Hitler had allowed a radical Nazi to become Minister of Foreign Affairs in 1933, it would be very difficult for Hitler to project that message of peaceful intentions. So he chose to keep the man in charge of the Foreign Office. He was called von Neurath. Okay, he was a conservative. Konstantin von Neurath was put in charge. Well, he was Hitler's Minister of Economics, so Minister of Foreign Affairs until 1938. Okay. Now, of course, we've already covered this. We know it's far from the truth. We know that Hitler was camouflaging his intentions, that in the long term he wanted to live in space. But at every stage, military conscription introduced in 1935, Hitler claimed it was for defensive reasons. Sending troops into the Rhineland, there's a picture of it there in March 1936. Hitler claimed it was for defensive reasons. March 1938, Germany invaded Austria. It was an invited invasion. There was no resistance. And then again in October 1938, when Hitler seized the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia, every single time Hitler claimed it was rightfully Germany's. I'm doing it for honourable reasons. And he got away with it at every single time. Okay, they were the stepping stones towards his real ambition, which was living space in the East. Okay, so there's our little Potterdam policy. And there's that man, von Neurath, who was in charge for much of this time. So it was to Hitler's advantage to use the traditional state institution of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, led by von Neurath, to maintain that camouflage. Because during this period, Germany was passing through a risky zone. If he provoked the Allies and they decided, no, we're not prepared to accept what you're demanding, it could have resulted in war, and Germany would have lost that war because Germany wasn't strong enough to fight a war yet. But then by 1938, the German army had increased in size, and so Hitler was increasingly confident that he didn't need to maintain this sort of like conservatives in the Foreign Office. He could put hard-nosed Nazis at the front of the Foreign Office because basically he was backed by a stronger army by 1938. Hence, 1938, von Neurath was removed and a Nazi, von Ribbentrop, took over his position. But that took until 1938. Okay, so again, there's that picture, therefore, the party takeover of the state was not allowed to happen in the first 4 or 5 years, but by the late 30s, Hitler's becoming more confident, and so there was an increasing takeover by the party of the state in the late 30s and moving into World War II. It was not a static picture, it was more nuanced than that. And then, of course, the other classic example is the armed forces. In the early years, while Hitler was expanding Germany's armed forces, he needed to create the impression it was for defensive reasons. It was to allow so he allowed the army to be led by conservative non-Nazis. So Blomberg, although he joined the Nazi Party, he was at heart a conservative. So these are the key position, Blomberg and Fritsch, and they held their positions. Blomberg and Fritsch, commander of the armed forces, Blomberg and commander of the army, Fritsch, until 1937. Because that was part of the front of maintaining an impression to the outside world that Hitler had called a halt to the revolution and everything was now returning to law and order, and Hitler's intentions were peaceful, which of course they weren't, because in the longer term he was aggressive. He wanted to wage war for living space, but when he was ready for that, he no longer needed to keep these people in position, so they fell in 1937-38, dismissed. Told you about that in an early video, how Blomberg that they dragged up personal issues about his wife being an ex-prostitute, and Fritsch was set up as being a homosexual when he wasn't, etc., etc. Very sort of like underhand gangster tactics that were used, and they were replaced by effectively generals who were much more committed to Hitler, okay, who were puppets of Hitler. So Keitel and Brauchitsch, Hitler knew he could trust these people to go to war for living space, to lead the German army into war for living space. So therefore there was a takeover at the top level of the army, but like with the economy and the Foreign Office, not until later on. Never a complete takeover at the top level, though. Many top generals kept quietly joined the opposition against Hitler. And during World War II, there was actually a significant plot by many of the senior old generals to have Hitler removed. But of course it failed. There we go. We've covered this particular topic. Hopefully that was useful and interesting for you. And I will sign out now. Thank you very much for listening. Goodbye.